Hi, my name is David Swartz. I'm a professor of history here at Asbury University, and I will be your guide through this course on the second half of Western civilization. This course is structured into 4 units, each relating in some way to the concept of modernity. In the first 2 units, we'll outline the rise of modernity, looking into new ways of organizing society, as well as the emergence of new ideas of science and practices of industry. In the second half of the course, we'll think about the crises of modernity. Not everything that is new is necessarily better, and so we'll take a look at things like the problems of imperialism and also at industrial warfare in World War I and World War II. Most historians date the beginning of the modern world at around the Renaissance and the Reformation, that is, around the 16th century, which was nearly 500 years ago. But what exactly is modernity, other than recent in the scope of human civilization? The best definition has to do with rationalization. This idea that decisions and social actions are based on efficiency and calculation instead of morality, emotion, maybe tradition. Economically, this meant a departure from a feudal economy to a focus on production in the most efficient ways possible. It first took the form of mercantilism, then of capitalism, then of the use of factories in the Industrial Revolution so that merchandise could be mass produced. Politically, modernity meant the departure from small regional principalities to the newer form of the nation state. This was a phenomenon that allowed a ruler to more efficiently rule big swaths of geography. And religiously, it took the form of disenchantment. It's better, moderns said, to explain the world without appealing to God or gods. Can you explain a famine scientifically without saying that God himself sent it as a punishment? If so, then explain it with science without appealing to the divine. These are all characteristics that remain, for good or ill, here in the 21st century. And in this course, we're going to try to understand some of these things better. We'll begin with Unit 1, the rise of modernity, new ways of organizing society. Now, the man that you see before you is Louis XIV. He was the king of France in the 17th century. Although he was thought of as more than mere man, he was known as the Sun King. He was seen as literal enlightenment, as the source and as the radiant giver of all life. The whole world, his subjects thought, revolved around Louis XIV. It's easy to understand why his subjects felt this way. He took the crown at the age of 4, and then he reigned until his death in 1715. This was a reign of 72 years, the longest documented reign of any European monarch in history. During this time, France was the leading ruler, the leading power in Europe. He presided over 3 major wars, and he was the absolute ruler after consolidating power after a time of unrest and disorder in France. A French writer later commented that it's the voice of genius of all kinds which sounds from the tomb of Louis. This was an over-the-top accolade that in a lot of ways symbolized the pomp and majesty of the throne on one hand, and then on the other hand, the obsequiousness of its subjects. In all honesty, Louis could and did say, "I am the state." Louis's palace reflected the grandeur of the throne. It was located at Versailles, which was about 35 miles away from Paris, and it was considered to be the greatest palace of the greatest king, Louis XIV, of the greatest state, France, in all of 17th century Europe. There were sculptured gardens in dazzling geometric forms. They stretched for acres. Visitors said that the flowers scented the air with exotic perfumes. There were 1,400 fountains. Water had to be pumped through elaborate pipes all the way from the River Seine. There was a canal. It was in the shape of a cross. It was more than a mile long, and it carried Italian boats, sometimes called gondolas, to a zoo and an aviary. And the palace was the most incredible of all. 5,000 people lived in the palace. It was of marble construction that cost 100 million French pounds. Louis XIV was not an easily embarrassed man, but this was over the top even for him, and he ordered that the official receipts be burned. You can see the Queen's bedroom here, made of gold, very formal and austere in some ways. The monumental Versailles was so uncomfortable to live in that Louis XIV built a private chateau on the grounds as a retreat away from the palace itself. Versailles may have been impressive. It also hid a lot of ugliness. It was very poorly drained. One observer said that the mud is black and stinking, with a stench so penetrating that you can smell it for several leagues around. The stench, of course, was from the sewage that got really noxious in the heat and in the rain. The gardens also were impressive, but they were unused. They were simply too vast for an aristocracy not given to physical exercise. The gardens, said an observer, were admired and avoided. There was also a town that surrounded the palace itself, and the town was hurting even as the palace grew wealthier. The poor got poorer in the 17th century. The reason is that France was deeply in debt during these years from the 7 Years' War. And so the state that is, began to heavily tax the poor. Now, it's important to understand the different classes of France in this era. The population was divided into three estates, or three groupings. The first was the clergy, who were not taxed at all, despite having vast landholdings. There were 10,000 clergy in France. The second estate was made up of the aristocracy, who also were not taxed, despite great wealth. There were 400,000 members of the aristocracy, and then the poor, who made up the third estate. This was the class that was heavily taxed. 28 million of them. So they comprised the majority of the population of France, all living together in one nation. And so what you have, according to one observer, is that the beautiful and the ugly were sewn together. The cartoon that you see depicts the plight of these French peasants. There's an old farmer who's bowed down under the weight of the privileged estates, the aristocracy, and the clergy. You can see some animals walking around this amusing scene. The birds and the rabbits could have been a form of sustenance for this old farmer, but they're protected by laws instituted by the aristocracy, who want to keep the birds and rabbits protected so that they can hunt them as game. In the end, the unfairness and the ugliness were too much for the populace to bear, especially in the face of the wealth and the power of Versailles and the royal state. As these inequalities became too great to bear, the common people threatened to revolt, and it finally happened in the year 1789. This painting by the French master Jacques Louis David captures a lot of these important themes. It's called The Oath of the Tennis Court. And what you see here is one of the most dramatic and decisive moments of the French Revolution. On June 17, 1789, there were a group of French dissidents who declared themselves to be deputies of the National Assembly. They were fed up with the problems. 3 days later, they met without the authority of the king. And so the king, who is now Louis XVI, the grandson of the Sun King who I described from a century earlier, Louis XVI ordered the king's guard to lock 577 of them out of their regular meeting room. This was an insult, and these deputies were outraged, and so they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court to plot their next steps. Let's take a closer look at the painting itself. You see three men gathered at the very front of the painting. Their arms are around each other. They're from different regions. They're not completely like each other, and yet they're standing in solidarity against oppression. The president of the National Assembly is standing behind these three men on a stage. He has his hand raised. Why? Because he's leading the deputies in the recitation of an oath. It's an oath that vows to, quote, never separate and to meet whenever circumstances demand until a constitution of the kingdom is established and affirmed on solid foundations. If you look at the rest of the National Assembly, they are in utter agreement, aren't they? Their hands are raised up, angled toward their leader to emphasize how momentous this action was. This thrust, this density of the bodies together are a signal of the hope and energy of this moment. If you look at the top of the painting, look at the windows. There's light streaming in from outside. The curtains are floating toward the center of the room. What this suggests is wind, the winds of change blowing in from the outside. This is a symbol of the Enlightenment, and this is the second major trajectory that you're going to be learning about in this unit. These are winds of change being blown in, not primarily from political sources, but from philosophical ones. Picture that you see before you is the meeting of a salon in 1755. These are the men and women that helped to lead the Enlightenment. Surrounding them are portraits, framed portraits of brilliant thinkers and leaders. The philosophers, the people who are sitting down, very nicely dressed, are participating in lively conversation. They're listening to papers being read and delivered on scientific and literary subjects. They discuss these papers with great seriousness, following very impressive dinner parties. Kind of the focal point of this painting is the man in red who's seated behind that black desk. He's holding a book, isn't he? A symbol of the literacy of this class of people in this age. These were high society events meant to highlight the great Enlightenment learning of this era. Your reading for this unit includes a lot of the writings of these Enlightenment figures, men and women who showed up at events like this. People like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, Montesquieu, and dozens of others. They believed, these philosophers did, in new ways of organizing society. Economically, they believed in laissez-faire capitalism, which you'll learn more about in your reading. Politically, they believed in balanced constitutions. That is, the king shouldn't determine everything. The common people, the third estate, should have a political voice. Socially, they believed that education could fix the ills of culture. The next two sketches that I'm going to show you demonstrate what these philosophers thought was possible. This first image is a depiction not of a French scene, but of an English scene. A lot of the themes that I've been discussing took place across Europe. This is not just a French phenomenon, but something that happened, in this case, in London, England as well. This depicts the London poor essentially in an alcoholic delirium, which was their only escape from the miseries of their daily lives. There are shocking scenes of addiction. If you look at the very left-hand part of this painting, this sketch, you can see a man holding up a saw with his right hand. This is a pawnbroker, a greedy pawnbroker who is paying pennies to a carpenter for his saw so that the carpenter can buy more gin. He's willing to give away the very source and method of his sustenance so that he can get more drink. There's starvation depicted here. Look at the bottom right-hand corner. This is a man that's alive, but just barely. He's starving. You can see his bones sticking through his stomach and chest. There's death all over the place. The center right, you can see two men pushing a wheelbarrow full of corpses. Look at the crumbling building at the top right. Society is crumbling, and so are individual lives. If you look at the boarded up door on the second story, there's a man hanging from a rope. This man committed suicide. This is how hopeless he saw his situation. There's madness, mental illness. Look at the face of the woman sitting on the steps. She's the focal point of this painting in part because her situation is so desperate. She has a crazed look on her face. She's trying to hold a baby. The baby has slipped from her arms and is about ready to crack its head open on the floor below. Look at her leg. You can see some open and festering sores on her leg. This is thought to be syphilis. It's a sexually transmitted disease. This woman is probably a prostitute. It's a horrendous scene. A depressing, hopeless depiction of urban life. There's a lot of truth to it. The philosophers of the Enlightenment had a new vision for society. They had new methods for implementing it. This is what they thought the ultimate result would be. What a contrast. This companion sketch shows how social reform can result in progress. You don't see bones sticking through skin anymore. You see bellies that are full and nourished. You see buildings that are getting fixed up. See the man painting the door, the center right. There's even a man constructing public art. It's an indication of prosperity. Only the pawnbroker shop is in trouble. At the top right there, it's getting boarded up. This is a good sign. This depiction shows how the philosophers sought to reorganize society so that it would result in prosperity, happiness, and a healthy social welfare. So there you have it. The rise of modernity meant new ways of organizing society. The remaining assignments in this unit will delve more deeply into the nature of these new ideas and methods. You're going to learn how kings justified their authority near the beginning of this era, and then about dissenters who resisted that authority as the unit progresses. You're going to learn a lot about the French Revolution, but also about how similar things were happening in England and in Holland. You're going to learn about philosophy, economics, education, and politics, all arenas in which modern thinkers sought to encourage progress in a world that seemed, well, stuck in medieval times. Well, that concludes our opening lecture. Your next assignment is to read from the textbook for a bit more narrative detail on the themes that I've just highlighted.